On the line with us is Yasmine Taeb. She is a human rights lawyer, progressive strategist, legislative and political director of Empower. On Twitter, it's at Yasmine Taeb, Taeb, Yasmine Taeb. Yasmine, welcome to the program. I understand that the Republicans in the House have proposed this H.R. 6408 bill that is, shall we say, at the very least, problematic. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Tom. I really appreciate it. So, as you noted, so HR 6408, I mean, most folks don't know, vast majority of folks do not know anything about it. It's the companion bill has been introduced in the Senate, whatever, 4136. Basically, this bill, in short, would, like the way they described it, it would amend the Internal Revenue Code to terminate the tax-exempt status of what they call terrorist supporting organizations. So basically, any 501, C3, C4 that is deemed by the Secretary of the Treasury to be providing material support or resources to a terrorist organization, they will be stripped of.
Which on its surface sounds reasonable, doesn't it?
Correct. On the surface, a lot of these bills, yes, that Republicans introduced and ran through the House have gotten passed. There's been numerous of them. This is one of the most, I would say, dangerous and problematic. And it seems, right, like on the surface, it seems pretty reasonable. And unfortunately, many of the Democrats also saw it the same way. The bill kind of passed without much controversy. Only 10 members in the House voted against it, which was really problematic. We actually just had a meeting with Senator Sanders' office earlier today about it, and they were unfortunately telling us that there are efforts to potentially bring it up under UC this week, which means unanimous consent, again, for legislation that has no controversy, or Republicans are trying to kind of ram it through the FAA, which is another kind of moving piece of legislation. And, for myself, I work for Empower Change Action Fund, which is the largest Muslim digital organization in the United States with over 500,000 members across the country. And for my organization, and we've been working day in, day out since October in fighting and advocating for ceasefire in order to save as many lives as possible, Israeli and Palestinian, and to finally see, the bloodshed and the slaughter in Gaza end. And for us, it's very clear that this legislation, which was introduced after October 7th, it was kind of rammed through in the House. They had a hearing a month later, and it just passed. It's very clear that it's very targeted towards organizations that are advocating for Palestinian human rights. It's very clear to us that it's political in nature, and it's honestly completely unnecessary. It doesn't do anything that existing law doesn't already cover. I mean, we have a series of kind of anti-terrorism laws that, if you're charged with supporting any sort of foreign terrorist organization, your assets are going to be frozen, right? Like there's so many different kind of, statutes and legislation already in place. But yeah, it's very problematic to say the least. And we're very concerned because it looks like it's kind of sailing through both chambers without any sort of pushback.
Is your concern that the law has provisions within it that essentially redefine what either terrorist organization or supportive terrorist organization means, or is your concern that if a less than high integrity administration were to come into place, like we had during the Trump administration, that a Secretary of the Treasury, a corrupt Secretary of the Treasury, might simply use it as a way of targeting organizations like yours and Ani Zonneveld's, Muslims for Progressive Values. She's a regular on our program. This could be a sword, a weapon used against legitimate organizations that reflect a constituency that's a very small minority in America.
Excellent question. It's actually both. So we are very concerned that under a not so ethical Secretary of Treasury that the legislation could absolutely be weaponized to go after any organization, right? It could even go after organizations advocating for reproductive justice and reproductive rights. Because the way it's kind of drafted, it's the language is actually not as narrowly tailored as some lawmakers think it is. It's actually quite broad. But it also does introduce what we see, this new standard. So in criminal proceedings, as you know, you're likely aware, the standard is quite high. This would lower the evidentiary standard. So in terms of, you know, what you would need to simply accuse an organization of supporting a terrorist organization, the standard is quite low. It's much lower than criminal proceedings, which means this legislation, if it becomes law, it would actually bypass the courts, right? It would bypass the courts. So they could, for example, if someone had a problem with my organization, they could falsely accuse us of providing support to Hamas. I don't know on what basis really, but they can make it up. And even though the organization, the entity or its officers or founders would never be charged under any sort of criminal terrorism statute, they would just use this legislation to kind of bypass the courts, right? To try to strip the organization of its tax status, to try to silence the organization. Again, we see it as an attack on freedom of speech, on political speech. And, you know, for me, when I read it, the other reason I think it's very problematic is, as you know, because of the humanitarian crisis right now that's like in the midst of Gaza, no kind of functioning hospitals. There's millions of Palestinians that have been displaced, over 40,000 that have been killed, over 75,000 that have been injured. There's a lot of organizations that are, you know, providing humanitarian assistance, and kind of the governing authority in Gaza is Hamas. So if any, right, like I can just picture a scenario where if an organization is, you know, crowdsourcing or fundraising for any sort of humanitarian purposes, if somehow that entity has ties to the governing entity in Gaza, which is Hamas, right? So you can see how this easily can go after just
sure. It'd be the same way they took down the UN effort in Gaza. Does this specify foreign terrorist, or does it just have general? Could it apply to a U.S.-based terrorist organization as well?
So it says terrorist supporting organization.
That's interesting. I wonder if you could get some Christian allies on this, because so many of the evangelical churches are very supportive of some of these hardcore right-wing movements that might be defined as terrorist organizations in the United States.
Right.
Or am I reaching here?
No, I think there's an advocate that actually made that argument as well in meetings with us. But yeah, I mean, unfortunately, not too many folks know about this. This was kind of a part of a series of, I would say, anti-free speech, anti-Palestinian human rights. Right. I mean, the bill also that passed out of the House last week that you may be aware of, this is the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that essentially just equates criticisms of Israel with anti-Semitism. So there's a slew of, unfortunately, very dangerous, very harmful, discriminatory bills that are being passed. And yeah, we just want as many folks to be aware. Is
here in Oregon, we're watching as AIPAC is quietly funding a crusade against Sushila Jayapal, Pramila Jayapal's sister, who's running for Congress here in Portland, or in this area. And you know, most people don't realize that these attack ads hitting her are being funded by AIPAC. Are they funding this legislation, or are they in any way behind this, or does this have nothing to do with Israel or any proxies for Israel?
So actually, this particular bill. So actually, Netanyahu a couple months ago. This is, I think it was in November. So he was actually the one that first. The Israeli government was the one that first started, like, pleading with U.S. officials that they should go after student groups. They should go after the organizations supporting these student movements. Right, like it's not a coincidence that this bill was then introduced in November. The hearing happened also later in November. One of the witnesses, who's from Foundation, this is FDD, Foundation for Defense of Democracy, is very right-wing, Islamophobic, pro-Iran war organization. They smeared in their testimony, the gentleman giving testimony, smeared American Muslims for Palestine, Student Justice, SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. So it's no coincidence that then last week there was a lawsuit, right, filed against those two organizations. So it's just for us, it's very difficult because we feel as though, right, like we're in the midst of this, what we call and what, the International Court of Justice, a federal U.S. court, numerous human rights organizations have termed a plausible genocide. We are trying to do everything we possibly can to counter and stop the assault on Gaza. And then meanwhile, we're also getting attacked, our organizations, with these frivolous lawsuits trying to silence our advocacy for ceasefire and for human rights.
Wow. We just have 30 seconds before we hit a break. I can't control here, Yasmine. What would you like our listeners to do in response to what you're telling us?
Sure. If they're able to reach out to their senators to simply voice opposition to this legislation.
It's before the Senate now.
Correct. It's before the Senate. It's S4136. And they can simply say, I want my senator to vote no on, and the name is, it's a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to terminate the tax exempt. It's basically like,
Senate Bill 4136.
Right. That targets charities to strip them of their status.
Right. I get it. Yasmine, thank you so much for dropping by today. Is there a website for your organization you'd like to put out?
Yep. It's MPOWER change.org.
Empoweredchange.org. Great. Yasmine, thank you so much for dropping by.
Great. Yasmine Taeb.
Thank you.